Thanks, please.
We're starting now the first of 3 core talks in the
It's only me. I cannot really hear. Do you have the same problem? Okay. I believe the IT guys are working on it. Okay. Just enjoy the.
It's been called by the New Testament. We're starting now the first of 3 core talks in the lectureship, which I've entitled Paul as Pastor and Teacher, under the more general rubric of Journey with Paul into the Heart of Ministry. I decided to focus this first one on how Paul instructed his converts to learn, because it was hearing Paul speak, and of course in some cases reading Paul's letters, that first connected him to people in his day. And it's through reading what Paul has to say in our scriptures that we mostly connect with him first in our own time. Paul has been called by the New Testament scholar Joseph Grassi the teacher of teachers in the early Christian days. And this is certainly not an overstatement. In fact, teaching is something which is constantly stressed by him. And the number of times words connected with teaching appear in his writings is legion. We shouldn't just look at those words, we should also look at the counterpart words to do with learning. Because for Paul, it's not primarily about what he says, but about what people can gain from what he says. That's important. It's interesting that in all the articles and books about Paul, you read lots of books on Paul as apostle, Paul as prophet, Paul as the evangelist, Paul as all sorts of things, but you'll find very few talking about Paul as teacher. And only a handful, for example, of the several thousand entries in the New Testament abstracts listing all sorts of dissertations done on Paul, focus on Paul as a teacher. But he did it a lot. And we find him doing it publicly and privately in the ancient world. We find him doing it in religious settings and in secular settings. We find him doing it formally, and we also find him doing it informally. It's not surprising that Paul ended up doing a lot of teaching because he was raised in a cosmopolitan city which was visited by popular philosophers from all over the ancient world. He himself went to a synagogue school and was taught seriously. He then went on to do advanced studies, doctoral work, I guess, in Jerusalem with some eminent rabbis. All these things come before us, as you know, in the New Testament. And amongst other things, as Acts 9, verse 3 following tells us, he was called by God to be a teacher, not only a teacher, but certainly, amongst other things, to be a teacher. What I'd like to focus on here is not so much the content of Paul's teaching. That's the most important part of it, of course, but there are many things written about that, many things said about that. You'll have had lots of lectures and sermons and other talks on that. But to talk about how he actually taught, the way he went about it, his actual teaching methods, you might say. Because part of Paul's effectiveness as a teacher was certainly not just what he said, but how he actually communicated it. And we can best do that by turning the question around that we often ask. Asking not so much, how can we become, with Paul's help, the most effective teachers, but rather, how can our students become the best learners through whatever we say? We need to focus not so much on what we want to deliver, but on what they not only need, but should most efficiently and comprehensively and deeply be learning. How do people learn best? And as I've thought about that and addressed Paul's writings with that question in mind, I've come up with 5, I'm sure there are others, but 5 possible answers. First is this, that people learn best through story-based as well as more general didactic instruction. When Paul writes or speaks, he doesn't just deliver a set of instructions, pieces of advice, explanations of Christian doctrine, various ethical injunctions, answers to particular issues that have been raised. He does all these things, but he does them within a framework, and the framework is God's overarching story of his relationship with us from creation through to the new creation. There's a grand story there. And Paul's teaching is aware of that story. It's delivered conscious of that story, and it specifically connects with that story in all sorts of obvious ways and sometimes implicit ways as he goes along. There's a lot more attention being given to this now in scholarship on the New Testament, as you know. Tom Wright has suggested that there are 3 basic narratives going on behind Paul's writings. First of all, narrative of God, narrative of Israel's life in the world, and thirdly, the narrative of Jesus' life. Last year at these lectures, you had Ben Witherington III with you, and he may have talked about, or you certainly have heard about, his way of approaching this. It's just a little different. He suggests there are 4 narratives or stories in Paul's greater framework. The first 3, the story of creation, the story of Israel, and the story of Christ. And the 4th one, which he adds to Tom Wright's list, is the story of Christians, including Paul himself. James Dunn, whose death sadly happened just a few months ago, a close friend of mine, went a little further than either Tom Wright or Ben Witherington and said there are 5 stories that we find embedded in Paul's writings. The first 4, which have just been mentioned, but that Paul's own life should be separated out. It's not just part of the story of Christians, it's for him a separate story or narrative alongside the story of other Christians. And that Paul, at various points in his writings, links what he says back into one or other or sometimes one or more parts of this overarching divine story. If I can just give you, read here a few examples of places where he does this. I just took 2 chapters out of 1 Corinthians, chapters 10, 1 through to the end of 11 and the beginning of 12, and found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different attempts to saying back into that story. 10:1. Now these things happened as an example, and he goes on to give examples from the Old Testament. 10:18. Consider the people of Israel, and he goes on to say something about an aspect of their life. 10:36. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, harking back to the doctrine of creation. 11:1. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ, reference to both his and Christ's story. 11:12. Adam and Eve are mentioned in connection with talking about male and female. And then in 12:2, proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes, another reference to part of the Christ story. So these are just examples of the way in which Paul anchors his knowledge and wisdom and instruction in the grand biblical narrative. It's something that we do from time to time, but we should probably do more of. We should draw our hearers' attention to where what we are saying connects with, flows out of, illustrates, is an implication of, or a direct echo of some part of God's greater story. And we should weave that story as a thread through our sermons, through our lectures, and through our other talks. We can do this spontaneously just by inserting it into the middle of something what we're saying. This is what Luther used to do quite often. He'd say something, pause, reflect for a moment, and then say, it's amazing, isn't it? How much what I've just said connects with what God was doing in such and such a case, or with Christ saying or doing something else. He would just insert these spontaneously into things he was saying to his students. In fact, the greatest theologian of the last century, Karl Barth, occasionally did this. There's that famous incident when Barth was in New York. He was at a press conference. There were a whole lot of people, particularly from the religious press and other press there, asking him questions. And one was, Dr. Barth, what do you think is the very heart of all that you are trying to say in your 14-volume Dogmatics? I thought for just a moment, and then he said nothing. He began to sing. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong, they are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. Wonderful response. We can do it through structuring learning moments when we speak, either a sermon, a talk, a lecture, where we give people time by asking them to think about how is what I'm saying linked up with any part of what you know of God's whole story of his relationship with humankind down through history. Talk about this amongst yourselves. Can you think of somewhere where the two come together? People will generally find this, at least one person in the group, sharing with each other. They might find more than one link, and then they can respond and share it back with the speaker. I once heard an evangelistic address given by Clifford Warren, a great storyteller in the Australian Church, children's educator. He spoke at a city in which I was serving in a church, and where I was actually the head counsellor at monthly evangelistic meetings held by Youth with a Mission. Held by Young Life. And when he got up to speak, he didn't actually preach. He just simply, off his own head, out of his own memory, told the story of Jesus' last days, the rest, his death and his resurrection out of the Gospels. He'd memorized 4 chapters of Mark's Gospel, and he did nothing but tell the story, made no other comment. Simply at the end, made an appeal for people to come forward. I sat in my chair thinking, who is going to come forward after just a reading? No attempt to apply it, no attempt to appeal to people to respond at a meeting where that happens month after month after month. And would you believe, as many people responded that night to what he said, as normally happened at such meetings. It was a marvellous demonstration of just how a story, the story, can communicate powerfully still, even in a form that's written 2,000 years earlier. Black preachers know all about this. When they preach in the spirit of that wonderful Negro spiritual, were you there when they crucified my Lord? They don't just preach about the crucifixion, they make the crucifixion so real and vivid and graphic in their hearers' imagination that they seem to be right there in the scene, watching it happen 2,000 centuries to 200 centuries ago. There are all sorts of ways in which we can connect the grand story to even the most specific messages that we give when we speak. Let me ask the question again. What is the second way in which the people who hear us can learn best what we want to say? They can learn it through not just our providing upfront presentations, but through being in the middle of them, engaging in to and fro conversations. Paul was someone who took this very seriously. I didn't know until it was pointed out to me that in his writings, he gives an extraordinary number of not just answers to all sorts of questions, but he provides a whole armory of questions to which he asks people to give answers. Paul is as much a question asker as he is an answer giver, which means he understands something that's at the secret of all conversations. They're not just about saying what I think, but asking people what they think or what's been happening, etc. There are over 250 questions in Paul's writings. And it's understandable that a lot of these are in a practical letter like the Corinthians, when he's dealing with all sorts of issues the Corinthians are raising. But not just there, even in his most so-called doctrinal, systematic work, Romans, over 100 questions are asked by the apostle. This is extraordinary. This is something which is endemic, just part of the way in which he so often operated. But just look anywhere in Romans and you'll find these coming across the page. And even there in his sermons to both the Jews and the Gentiles in Acts 13 and Acts 17. So Paul is a great question asker, getting conversations going. Paul is also a good debater. We read about him in the Hall of Tyrannus in Athens, Acts 19, debating with others who attend. This is something he did often in that kind of setting. We find in Acts 20, when he's just in a church, it doesn't say that he preached to the church, it doesn't say that he spoke to the church. So you can find that in your translations of Acts 20, verse 7. It says that he dialogued with those who were present. The Greek word is the same as our word dialogue. It's the word we get it from. Paul did not so much engage in a monologue, but in a to and fro discussion with people in his church. That's how he sermonized, you might say. In fact, the word sermo appears in the Latin translation of that passage a little bit later, where it talks about what Paul did after this more dialogue type encounter with the church. It says that when they sat down to have the Lord's Supper together, he conversed with them until dawn. They had a good conversation, which Jerome, in his day, translated as sermonized with them, because in the beginning, a sermon was a conversation, even in the 4th century, not just a monologue. Paul himself in Colossians chapter 4, verse 6 encourages Christians to let your conversation always be seasoned with salt so that you know how to answer everyone. In other words, all of your talks with other people, all the conversations you get involved in with all sorts of people at all sorts of times in all sorts of places ought to be something which has a bit of an edge, which gets them intrigued, which gets them interested, which wants them to follow up with you something about why you are who you are, why you believe what you believe, why you do what you do. When you look at the sort of questions that Paul asked and consider why or what kind of questions he asked, you come up with this. Sometimes he asks questions to seek information, sometimes to confirm facts, sometimes to gain attention, sometimes to procure assent, or encourage reflection, or elicit a response, or stir conscience, or press for an application, or push for a conclusion, or express a feeling, or probe a motive, or raise an alternative. That's some 15 different kinds of questions Paul asked. He was a very versatile question asker, as we ourselves should be. And whenever we're in a teaching situation, in whatever setting, whether formal, informal, in a Christian setting or not, with educated people or uneducated people, we ought to make it an hospitable place in which not only we can ask all sorts of questions of them, but they can ask all sorts of questions of us. Because that way you get to the heart of things. You get down to the nitty-gritties, as we say. You get a real in-depth conversation encounter going on. I've seen some wonderful examples of this. The New Testament scholar Edward Schweitzer, I discovered, before he preached any sermon, a few days before, would ask several people in the congregation he was going to be speaking at to have a meeting with him, in which he said, this is the passage that I'm going to be preaching on. What do you think about it? And we get all sorts of answers from such a wide range of people. Then he would say, this is what I'm thinking of saying. What do you think about that? And get their responses to his sort of half-prepared sermon. And he would say, are there any other ways in which you think I could somehow make this more down to earth and relevant to the people in the congregation? And he would get their answers to that. That's why Edward Schweitzer was regarded as the best preacher in the whole of the city of Basel, because he asked lots of questions of lots of people first before he put together what he wanted to say. I met with a pastor in Hollywood, a woman who, after every sermon she preached, arranged a little meeting for those interested in the church hall who wanted to come along and ask her questions about what she had said, where she could ask questions about whether or not it was connected with their lives. A friend of mine, a theologian, he's a Kemmler in Switzerland. I was staying in his home once that he asked me to Bible study that he was conducting, and for 1 hour and 15 minutes, all he did was ask questions. He never volunteered a statement. There were 10 other ordinary Christians in the room, and all he did was ask questions of them about the Bible passage that they had read, and they had a Bible in their hands. And I went up to him after. I said, "Peter, that was amazing." I said, "I came expecting you to expound from the Bible all the things you wanted to say. But all you did was ask questions. But then when I went away and thought about it, I realised you actually got the people to say what you wanted to say by getting them to think about what you were asking them, and they answered themselves out of their own understanding and the passage what it was you wanted to communicate." He smiled at me with a little curl of the lip and said, "Of course." That's the way he did it. Karl Barth, the great theologian I mentioned earlier, conducted his postgraduate seminars not by standing up and speaking for 2 hours, by asking 4 people out the front who had read something from his own writings and something from the other writings that he was discussing, and asking them questions for 2 hours. That's all he did. But he too was able to draw from them whatever it was he wanted them to learn. An extraordinary feat, which I saw taking place in the life of a man in his mid-80s. Quite remarkable. We need to think about all sorts of ways in which we can ask questions, encourage conversations to go deeper, in order to help people learn best whatever it is we want them to discover. Thirdly, the third way in which people can learn best is by our sharing not just our knowledge and wisdom, such as it is, but our own thought through experience of God, and our own feelings about that. Paul did this a lot. If I can just read a couple of passages. He says in 1 Thessalonians 2:8, "We were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you had become so dear to us." Or to Timothy, in Timothy 3:10 and 11, "You know all about my teaching, but also my way of life, my purpose, my faith, my patience, my love, my endurance, my persecutions, and my suffering." We often focus so much on either sharing our knowledge without our experience, or sharing bits and pieces of our experience which are not informed by our knowledge, that we don't do what Paul himself did. Has it occurred to you, as it has occurred to me, that perhaps Paul's own teaching on the atonement, the death of Jesus, which is the richest in the New Testament, came not just from reflecting on Jesus' death in the light of Old Testament scriptures, but also on reflecting on his own innocent suffering as an apostle at the hands of his opponents and many people in his own churches, and what that did to him, what that cost to him, but what it somehow brought about in the lives of those who were there or who heard about it, because he bore it like Jesus bore our sins on the cross. That's certainly the conclusion some scholars are now coming to. Paul certainly refers to his own experiences quite a lot when he's instructing his hearers or his readers. There's that wonderful passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 where he's dealing with a very difficult problem of a member of the church who's done the wrong thing and he's not feeling very apologetic about it. And the church has treated him initially a bit harshly, and Paul wants them to really understand that now something more is needed. And he talks about his own response to what they have said to him and what they've said about this other person. And the emotions that come through, you can document them yourself by reading 2 Corinthians 2, 1 to 11. He talks about his pain, he talks about his grief, he talks about his anguish, he talks about his distress, he talks about his tears, he talks about his joy, he talks about his comfort, he talks about his love. All those in 10 verses. That's how much he's willing to share what's going on in his heart not just because he likes to be experiential or show off his feelings. No, it's because it's evoked by his response to this very difficult, practical Christian issue, which he's seeking to find a gospel response to. Parker Palmer, American educator, thought a lot about this. And let me just read a short paragraph of his book, The Courage to Teach. Our deeply rooted tendency is to externalize truth, to communicate it to others. But truth is not essentially a purely objective phenomenon that we can analyse, describe, or point others to. While it does have a real existence outside ourselves, it's more subject to whom we are pledged and with whom we are in relationship. The word truth comes from our word troth, an old English word, which embraces a very personal, even private affair. In fact, the metaphor affair isn't at all out of place. This conveys something of the intimate relationship we should have with the truth. It is to become fully part of us. We must become betrothed or have an affair with it. If it's to become fully part of us, we can only share it with others through courting them so that they can experience it just as we have heard it. So to a fourth way in which others learn best through the way we speak. They learn through receiving material in their imagination, not just receiving material in their minds, that is information. I'm not sure how much you've thought about the fact as to whether Paul was an imaginative teacher. It's not something that comes to mind most people when they have Paul in view. Jesus, yes, with his parables. The prophets, yes, with their word pictures and symbolic actions, which demonstrated what they were wanting to convey. But Paul, surely he was a more logical, didactic thinker. He was in some respects, but not in others, because his writings are saturated with word pictures, similes, metaphors, analogies, sometimes allegories, personifications. All of these regularly occur in Paul's writings. At times, he will choose one particular metaphor and run with it through several writings because it is key to people understanding what he's saying. In such places, the word picture is not just an illustration of what he wants to say, it is the actual core or heart of what he wants to say. The church as a body is one. It's a metaphor you know well, and you perhaps are familiar with. It occurs in several letters, and it occurs in all sorts of ways. Sometimes he talks about it as if the church is the whole body. Sometimes he talks about it as if the church is the torso of the body and Christ is the head. Sometimes he talks about it by referring to particular limbs of the body, eyes, ears, hands, feet, etc., because he wants to make a particular point. In other words, he has a very versatile approach to the way in which this understanding of the church can be talked about and help people understand what it is that the church should be and what it is that the church should do. Of course, he talks about the church in other ways as well, as a building, as a field, as a bride. He's not limited to just one metaphor. And in talking about the Christian life, he has a whole range of ways in which you can do this. One of the most common is of the Christian life as walk, as you might recall. We often use that expression ourselves, our Christian walk. Paul uses this picture about 35 times in his writings, very frequently. But he doesn't just use it in a large way of the whole process of the Christian life, but he uses it in smaller ways of different aspects of the Christian life. To mention just a few, he'll talk about putting on the shoes of your feet, looking carefully how you walk, walking a straight path, walking in the steps of another, walking in the light, walking too slowly, washing the dust off someone else's feet, each of which means something or refers to something specific in the Christian life. But it means that when Paul walked, he had his eyes open, little parables or pictures kept coming to him from God of how this could transfer into a way of understanding what being a Christian actually meant. The walking was just one of the metaphors he uses. David Williams, the Australian scholar, has combed through Paul's writings and found that virtually every aspect of life at the time is drawn on by Paul at some point or other to convey something about the Christian faith. Metaphors drawn from the city, from neighbourhoods, rural life, villages, family, life, the life of friendship, physical provisions, material goods, slavery, freedom, citizenship, politics, law courts, justice, manufacturing, business, marketing, warfare, the army, public shows, sporting events. Anything and everything is grist to Paul's mill when he wants to convey something profound about the Christian life. We need to follow in his footsteps here, to use one of his metaphors, as many of the great Christians have done down through the centuries. Martin Luther was a master of word pictures. So was the Danish lay thinker, so particularly C.S. Lewis, who said that the world is charged with the grandeur of God, and everywhere you look and see, you will see little pictures of God coming before you if you have your mind open, your imaginations ready, your ears and senses at work to pick up the signals God is sending you, not only for you to learn something yourself, but to convey something to others through. This is what we need to be doing so often in the ways in which we teach with others, helping them to connect their imaginations to what it is that we're saying. Not just through word pictures, but through getting them, for example, to play the part of other people in the biblical story so they get inside their minds and heads, men to play women's parts, women to play men's parts, reconstructions of the Book of Esther, evangelistic classes or study groups, helping people to get inside the minds and imaginations and hearts of the people they're seeking to convert, friends, parents, wives, by playing them to somebody else so that they themselves are forced to think, imagine and feel the way their parents, friends, or wives or husbands actually think, to help them better understand how to convey the gospel to them. Finally, the last effective way of helping people learn is to encourage them to do, not just to hear what it is we want them to understand. That's part of what I've just been saying in a way. But there are other larger ways in which we can encourage this to happen. Paul himself took people around with him on his mission tours. It's estimated some 30 all told, so that they not only heard him teach, but watched the way he did it and actually engaged with him in the doing of it. They became colleagues, participants in what was actually taking place. Already mentioned how Paul set up churches so that people, for the main, didn't just sit and listen to what others said or join in the occasional hymn or prayer, but were all actually contributors to what was taking place. As he says in 1 Corinthians 4:26, they brought along a hymn, a word of wisdom, a piece of faith, some encouragement, some gift, some physical sustenance that they could give to others in the church, so that everybody was actually involved in what was happening in church, not just consuming what was happening in church. Paul did this frequently, and we need to do it ourselves. I can focus just for a minute or two on a seminary setting such as your own. There are possibilities within our classes for doing something more than we often do. A biblical studies course on the prophets taking place not just in a classroom, but in a suburb or village with a specialist in urban or village mission alongside us, so that you are actually with students doing what you're talking about, not just talking about what you're talking about. A course on the creation, which doesn't take place in a room, with people's backs to the windows where they can't even see the trees and the mountains and the fields outside, but actually out in the creation itself, camping overnight for 2 or 3 nights perhaps, being present in God's creation, feeling it, sensing it, touching it, looking at it, handling it, conserving it, preserving it, as well as reading the book of Genesis and the Psalms and what they say about creation. A church history course which doesn't just look at issues to do with what was going on in the 3rd or the 5th or the 9th or the 16th century involving the ordinary people of God, but issues today which also are similar to the ones that they experienced, where students interact with, engage in, debate with, and over various issues that they need to be discussing, etc., etc. Much more could be said. I sought to identify 5 areas in which we can help people learn more than they often do by learning ourselves through that how to teach better what we want to convey. The whole thing is summed up in the biblical word edification. In our teaching, we're not primarily there to educate, we're there to edify, not just to fill people's minds, but to fill their imaginations, to fill their spirits, to fill their hearts, to galvanise their actions, so that they actually respond as whole people fully and engage in fully with whatever it is that we want to say. That is the biblical standard, you might say, for what learning and teaching is all about. It's not our teaching to simply prepare people for ministry, but in ways to usher them into ministry, if not directly at the time as much as they fully can, at least partly through that, and then more fully afterwards in ways which are deeply practical. Because only if we do this, will our teaching ensure that people are instructed in a way that will help, as Paul himself desired and did, to turn the world outside them upside down, to make a huge difference in the lives and the communities and the societies of the people in which we live. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Robert Banks, for the wonderful lecture. I think we are all challenged and blessed by the lecture today.